The first crack was barely noticeable, like a hairline fracture in an otherwise polished mirror. Rachel mentioned her college reunion offhand, almost like she was just thinking out loud one evening over dinner. "It's coming up in a few weeks," she said, absently stirring her pasta. "A lot of people I haven't seen in years are going. It could be fun." I nodded, shrugging. "Sure, sounds like a nice break for you." It was an innocent enough comment, one I thought she'd forget in a couple of days. Rachel and I were just getting back to something that felt like normal. Life had been a grind lately: work, bills, managing the little crises that seemed to pop up every other day. Our relationship had seen its share of distance and tension, but I thought we were over that, ready to start building back what had been eroded. But the reunion, she kept bringing it up, almost obsessively. She'd say things like, "It'll be great to reconnect," and "I wonder what everyone's been up to." I noticed she started putting more effort into herself too, more than I'd seen in years. She was spending extra time at the gym, bought new clothes, and started trying new hairstyles. I hadn't seen her this excited or invested in a long time. "Looking forward to it?" I asked one evening, watching her brush out her hair in front of the bathroom mirror. She smiled, glancing at me through the reflection. "It'll be fun. Besides, it's been forever since I saw those people," she said with a casual shrug. Her tone was light, but something about the way she said it made me feel off. The night before the reunion, we had a small argument, sparked by nothing and escalating over everything. She mentioned she might stay out late, and I'd casually asked if she'd be home that night or planning to stay with one of her friends. "Are you seriously questioning me?" she snapped, her eyes narrowing. "No, I just thought you'd be home after the reunion. That's all," I replied, surprised at her reaction. "Just let me have a night out without the third degree, okay? God, you're acting like I'm going to disappear or something," she said, turning away and grabbing her phone. Her tone was harsh, dismissive, like I was an annoying it she couldn't wait to brush off. I didn't argue further. I knew better than to push things, especially when she'd made up her mind. The next evening, Rachel left for her reunion in a new dress, looking more radiant than I'd seen in years. She barely glanced back as she walked out, giving me a quick wave over her shoulder. Watching her go, I couldn't shake a strange sense of foreboding, like I was watching something unfold that I couldn't stop. But I pushed the thought away, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Hours passed. I tried distracting myself with TV, a book, even some late-night emails from work. But as midnight approached, I grew restless. My phone lay silent on the coffee table. I resisted the urge to text her, not wanting to seem overbearing, but each minute of silence felt heavier than the last. At 1:30 a.m. my phone buzzed. I reached for it, relieved, expecting a message saying she was on her way home. But the message was short, almost cold. "I'll be staying at Jessica's tonight. Don't wait up." A wave of unease washed over me. Jessica was her best friend from college, someone she'd always kept in touch with, so staying there made sense. But the way she phrased it, it felt strange, like she was cutting off any attempt at conversation. I sent back a quick, "Okay, hope you had a good night," hoping for a response. But there was nothing. Just silence. The next morning, I woke up early, hoping to hear her come through the door. By 10 a.m., she still wasn't back. I was pacing, wondering if I should call or wait it out, when she finally walked through the door, looking every bit like she'd had the time of her life. She was humming softly, still in that new dress, her makeup slightly smudged. She greeted me with a cheerful "Morning," as if she just stepped out for a quick coffee. I stared at her, trying to process my thoughts. Should I ask her where she'd been, demand to know why she hadn't messaged me back? But the way she looked at me, almost daring me to bring it up, made me swallow my words. Instead, I just said, "Morning." She breezed past me, heading into the kitchen to make herself coffee, acting as though nothing unusual had happened. Her phone chimed with a message, and she picked it up, smiling to herself as she read it. I watched her, a strange mix of anger and suspicion brewing inside me. But I kept quiet, forcing myself to let it go. That evening, As we sat in silence over dinner, the tension was palpable. I couldn't look at her without remembering that message, that distant "Don't wait up." And yet, she seemed perfectly content, eating her meal with barely a glance in my direction. A few days passed, and I tried to let it go, telling myself I was overthinking things. But the image of her walking in the next morning, her nonchalant greeting, the distant look in her eyes, it all gnawed at me. Then, one night, as we were settling down after dinner, she mentioned that she was planning to go out again. "Just to Jessica's for a night," she said casually. "It'll be good to catch up properly without the whole reunion crowd." I froze. I couldn't help but think back to her reunion night, to the silence and the strange sense of disconnect I'd felt. But I swallowed my unease, forcing a smile. "Sure, have a good time." She left soon after, giving me a quick peck on the cheek. But as soon as the door shut, I grabbed my keys. I didn't even think about what I'd do if she wasn't where she said she'd be. I just knew I had to find out. I drove to Jessica's house, parking a little down the street. Sure enough, Rachel's car was there, parked in the driveway. I felt a wave of relief mixed with a strange sense of guilt for even doubting her. I sat there for a few minutes, watching the house, half expecting her to come out at any moment. But nothing happened. The lights were on, everything looked normal, and after a while, I drove back home, feeling like an idiot for even letting my mind wander. But the relief didn't last. The following week, I was meeting up with an old friend, Matt, for drinks. We hadn't seen each other in months, and it felt good to catch up, to talk about something other than work and family. But as the night wore on, he hit me with a question that stopped me in my tracks. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair with a smirk, "how's married life treating you?" I laughed, shrugging. "It's good. You know, the usual." He raised an eyebrow, a strange look crossing his face. "So you and Rachel are still together?" I frowned, taken aback. "Of course. Why would you ask that?" He hesitated, glancing around as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "Well, just... I heard something. Don't take it the wrong way, but have you talked to her recently, like, about what she's been up to?" I stared at him, a sinking feeling taking hold in my chest. "What are you getting at, Matt?" He shifted uncomfortably, looking down at his drink. "Listen, I wasn't going to bring it up, but my wife, Laura, she mentioned something. Apparently, Rachel hooked up with someone from her reunion. I don't know if it's true, man. It could just be a rumor." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I sat there, struggling to breathe, to process what he was saying. Rachel, my wife, the woman I thought I knew inside and out, cheating on me. I wanted to laugh, to brush it off as nonsense. But deep down, something cracked, something that had been held together by hope and denial. I downed the rest of my drink, barely tasting it, my mind spinning with a million questions, 1,000 possibilities. Matt's words echoed in my mind as I stared at the bar, wondering how I'd missed the signs, how I'd let myself be so blind. And I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The drive home that night was a blur, Matt's words playing in my head like a broken record. Apparently, Rachel hooked up with someone from her reunion. It didn't make sense. Rachel, the woman I had trusted with everything, betraying me? Part of me wanted to dismiss it as gossip, something overheard and blown out of proportion. But that uneasy feeling from the night she'd gone to her reunion was back, sharper than ever, gnawing at me. When I got home, Rachel was already asleep. She looked peaceful, her face relaxed in the dim light from the hall. I watched her for a moment, anger boiling under my skin, wondering how she could sleep so soundly if she'd done something like that. But then, maybe that's why she was so calm. Maybe she thought I'd never find out. That I was oblivious enough to just keep looking the other way. I went downstairs, poured myself a drink, and sat in the dark living room, trying to figure out what to do next. My mind jumped back to all the subtle changes in her behavior lately. The long nights out, the new clothes, that distant look she sometimes wore. Had I missed the signs all along? The next morning, I was ready to confront her. But when she walked into the kitchen, smiling, humming as she poured herself a cup of coffee, My voice got caught in my throat. How do you accuse someone you've loved for years of something so awful, especially if there's a chance it might not even be true? So instead of confronting her, I kept quiet, watching her with a new kind of suspicion that felt foreign and wrong. That whole week, I couldn't focus on anything. My work emails piled up, meetings blurred together, and all I could think about was Rachel and that reunion. Was it really just a rumor, or was there something more? I started paying closer attention to her, watching her every move, every glance at her phone. She'd been distracted before, but now, it was like she was in a different world. When she wasn't glued to her phone, she'd be lost in thought, her eyes distant, as if she was somewhere else entirely. That Friday, she mentioned another night out with Jessica. She's going through a rough patch, she said over breakfast, stirring her coffee. She needs someone to talk to. I'll probably be out late. I nodded, masking my suspicion. Of course, do whatever you need to. Her eyes flickered to mine, and for a second, I thought I saw a flash of guilt. But then, just as quickly, she looked away, brushing it off. Thanks. I won't be long. When she left that night, I felt a strange mix of anger and excitement. This time, I wouldn't just sit around wondering. I grabbed my keys and followed her car, keeping my headlights off as I trailed a few cars behind. She drove toward the neighborhood where Jessica lived, but right before she reached the street, she took a left, heading in the opposite direction, toward the edge of town. My pulse quickened as I watched her turn down a dimly lit road. The road led to a small, quiet bar I'd never seen her go to. I parked far enough away that she wouldn't notice and waited. Sure enough, she walked in alone. A few minutes later, a man joined her at the bar. Even from a distance, I could see the familiarity in their greeting, the way her face lit up when she saw him. He was tall, about my age, with an easy smile and an arm that found its way around her shoulder all too quickly. I felt a sickening wave of betrayal wash over me. My hands clenched the steering wheel so tightly I could feel my knuckles cracking, but I forced myself to stay put. I had to see this through. I watched them laugh, their heads close together, his hand resting on her lower back like he had every right to touch her that way. The way she leaned into him, smiling up at him like I'd always wanted her to smile at me. It was like watching a scene from someone else's life, but that someone was my wife. They stayed there for a while, talking, laughing, and drinking. My mind raced, wondering how long this had been going on. Had it started before the reunion? Was it something even deeper, something I'd been blind to for months, maybe even years? At one point, she looked around, almost as if she sensed someone watching, but she didn't see me. She just went back to him, leaning even closer, her body language more open, more relaxed than I'd seen in months. After an hour or so, they got up, and I tensed, wondering if I'd have to follow them to a hotel or some other place. But instead, they walked out to the parking lot, and I quickly ducked down, watching through the rearview mirror. They were standing beside her car, talking. He was saying something to her, his hand cupping her face, and she was nodding, her eyes soft and warm in a way I hadn't seen in years. They kissed, just a quick, stolen kiss, but it was enough to make my stomach turn. I fought the urge to jump out of the car, to yell, to demand an explanation. But I stayed put, watching as she finally pulled away from him, her fingers lingering on his arm. She climbed into her car, and he watched her drive off before heading back into the bar. I sat there, numb, my mind struggling to catch up with what I'd just seen. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I had trusted with everything, was living a life I wasn't a part of. I watched her drive away, the taillights fading into the distance, taking with them whatever remained of the trust I'd had in her. When I got home, she was there, sitting on the couch as if nothing had happened. She looked up and smiled, her face so open, so friendly, that for a second I almost forgot what I'd seen. But then she glanced down at her phone, that same far-off look in her eyes, and I knew. There was no denying it now. Rachel was hiding something from me. The next day, I decided to tell Matt. If anyone could give me a straight answer, it would be him. He'd known us both for years, and I trusted him to be honest with me, even if it hurt. We met for lunch, and I didn't waste time with small talk. "I saw her, Matt," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "With some guy. It wasn't just a rumor." Matt's face fell, and he let out a long sigh. "I didn't want to believe it, man. But Laura told me about it last week. Apparently, Rachel's been seeing him since the reunion. I thought it was just gossip, but—" "So you knew?" I said, my voice trembling. "You knew, and you didn't tell me?" He looked down, guilt etched into every line of his face. "I wanted to tell you. I did. But I didn't want to ruin things if it wasn't true. I hoped it was just talk, that maybe someone had seen her talking to an old friend and jumped to conclusions." I felt a strange kind of calm wash over me, like I was watching the whole thing unfold from a distance. I knew now. I had the confirmation I'd been dreading. Rachel had lied to me. She'd betrayed me, and I'd been too blind, too trusting to see it. When I got home that night, Rachel was in the kitchen, humming as she made dinner. She looked up when I walked in, her face lighting up with a smile, but I couldn't bring myself to smile back. "Hey," she said, her voice light and cheerful, as if everything was perfectly normal. "How was your day?" I wanted to tell her everything I knew, to lay it all out and demand answers. But instead I just shrugged, forcing myself to keep the anger buried. "Fine. Just the usual." She went back to cooking, completely oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I watched her, wondering how long she'd been playing this game, how many times she'd come home to me with his taste still on her lips. That night, as she slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. I knew I couldn't let this go. I couldn't just sit here and pretend like everything was fine. I needed a plan, a way to make her pay for what she'd done. And as I lay there in the dark, an idea began to take shape, something that would make her feel the same pain, the same betrayal she'd inflicted on me. But for now, I'd keep my cool. I'd watch, wait, and let her believe she'd gotten away with it. Because when the time came, I'd be ready. And I knew one thing for certain: whatever happened next, she'd never see it coming. The next few days, I played the part of the clueless husband perfectly. I smiled, laughed at her jokes, and even kissed her goodnight as though nothing had changed. Every time she turned to me, her face open and cheerful, I wanted to scream, to ask her how she could lie to me so easily. But I bit my tongue and waited. Rachel, though, she'd started acting differently too. If I hadn't known any better, I might have thought she was making an effort to be closer. Her conversations felt lighter, more intentional, like she was putting on a show of affection she thought would cover her tracks. She'd smile at me, ask about my day, even lean in for random hugs. But I could feel the hollowness of it all. It was nothing but a performance, a way to keep me blind to what she was really up to. I decided to do something I never thought I'd do. That Friday morning, I called in sick to work, and after Rachel left for her job, I got to work setting up a plan. First, I installed a tracker on her car, a small device I could monitor from my phone. It was something I'd read about but never thought I'd actually need. I hated myself for stooping this low, but I needed to know the truth, every last detail. That evening, she mentioned she was going out again, for a quick drink with some of the girls from work. I nodded, forcing a smile as she made her way to the door. But as soon as she was gone, I grabbed my phone and watched her little blue dot on the tracker move. At first, it headed in the direction of the bar she'd mentioned, but then, it took a sudden turn and headed back toward that same quiet spot on the edge of town, the same place she'd gone with him last time. I followed, keeping my distance, my mind racing as I pictured what I might see. But when I pulled into the parking lot, I realized they hadn't even bothered to keep up the bar routine this time. Instead, she was already standing beside him, laughing as he leaned against his car. His hand rested casually on her shoulder, his fingers tracing light circles on her arm as she spoke, her head tipped back in laughter. I felt my heart drop, an ugly realization sinking in. This wasn't just a fling. They looked like a couple. Comfortable, casual, as if they'd been doing this for months, maybe longer. The thought turned my stomach, and I gripped the wheel tightly, trying to calm myself. I needed to focus, to hold on to my composure. I took out my phone, snapping a few photos of them together, their intimate postures speaking louder than words. As I drove home that night, I played through every possibility in my head. How long had this been going on? Had it started before the reunion, or was it just a coincidence that things had come to a head around then? I kept picturing them together, their laughter, her hand resting on his chest. I couldn't stop the images from flooding my mind. Rachel came home late, her cheeks flushed from laughter, or maybe from the drinks she was pretending to have had with her friends. She slipped her shoes off by the door, then came over to where I was sitting on the couch, watching TV. "Hey," she said, her voice soft as she leaned down to kiss me. I forced myself to stay still, to let her touch me without flinching. She smelled faintly of cologne, a scent I didn't recognize, and it took everything in me not to push her away. The next morning, my resolve hardened. I decided I wouldn't just sit around and let this happen in the shadows. I needed answers. So I started digging. I went through her social media, her emails, her calendar, anything I could find that might give me more information. But Rachel was careful. There was nothing obvious, nothing that directly linked her to him. But then I found something, a receipt from a hotel, tucked away in an email she'd hidden in a folder labeled finance. The date matched the night of her reunion. I stared at it for a long time, the words blurring in front of me as the finality of it sank in. She hadn't even tried to hide it, not really. She just filed it away, like some dirty little secret she thought I'd never find. That night, I couldn't keep my anger in anymore. We were sitting at the dinner table, eating in silence, when she looked up at me, her eyes curious. "You okay? You seem distracted lately," she said, her tone laced with concern. I looked up, meeting her gaze, and forced a casual smile. "I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind." She studied me for a second, and I wondered if she could sense the shift in me. But then she shrugged, brushing it off, going back to her dinner as if everything was perfectly fine. I had to stop myself from laughing at the absurdity of it all. How could she sit there, so composed, so unaffected? As she talked about her plans for the weekend, I couldn't hold back any longer. "So," I said, setting my fork down, "are you planning to see him again?" She froze, her face going pale, but she quickly recovered, her eyes widening in confusion. "C'est vous? Don't play dumb, Rachel." I leaned forward, my voice low and controlled. "I know about him. The guy from the reunion. I've seen you with him. I know what's going on." Her face drained of color, and she stammered. It's not what you think. It's nothing. It was just one night." Her voice trembled, and for a brief moment, I almost believed her. But then the anger surged back, the images of her with him flashing through my mind. "One night?" I laughed bitterly. "Is that supposed to make it better? Because it wasn't just one night, Rachel. I've seen you meet him more than once. I followed you last night, in case you didn't notice." Her expression shifted from panic to guilt, and she looked down, avoiding my gaze. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for it to get this far. I didn't know how to stop." "How long?" I demanded, my voice sharp. She hesitated, glancing up at me with tear-filled eyes. "Since the reunion," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I reconnected with him there, and things just happened." I felt a hollow laugh escape me. "Things just happened? Is that what you're calling it?" She wiped a tear away, her hands shaking. "I'm sorry. I didn't want this." I watched her, feeling a mix of rage and disgust. "Didn't want this? Rachel, you've been lying to me for months. Don't pretend this was some accident." For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of the betrayal hanging between us like a thick fog. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll leave," she said, standing up slowly. "I'll go to Jessica's tonight. I think we both need space." "Fine," I said, not looking at her as she left. I heard her gather a few things and then, Without another word, the door clicked shut behind her. The moment she was gone, I grabbed my keys and followed her again, my anger boiling over as I watched her car turn onto Jessica's street. This time, I parked a bit farther back, watching from the shadows as she knocked on Jessica's door. She waited a moment, then disappeared inside. For hours I sat there, waiting, wondering if I'd see him pull up or if she'd just walk out and go back to him. But there was nothing. Just the quiet house, the dim glow of the porch light, and the faint flicker of a TV in the living room. Eventually, I drove home, still seething, the betrayal like a splinter I couldn't remove. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of her coming in. She looked exhausted, her face pale and drawn, but she didn't say anything. We avoided each other for the rest of the day, the silence between us more hostile than any argument could have been. But I knew I couldn't leave things like this. She might have spent the night at Jessica's, but I didn't believe for a second that it was over. Not after everything I'd seen. I decided to pay Jessica's husband, Tom, a visit. If anyone knew what was really going on, it would be him. I hadn't spoken to Tom much over the years, but he was a straightforward guy, the kind who wouldn't sugarcoat the truth if he knew it. When I called him, he agreed to meet up, his voice cautious, as if he already knew why I was calling. We met up that evening at a quiet bar, and after a few minutes of small talk, I got straight to the point. "I think Rachel's been seeing someone," I said, watching his reaction closely. He hesitated, glancing down at his drink before meeting my gaze. "Laura told me something," he said finally, his voice low. "She mentioned that Rachel, that she'd been with someone from the reunion." I felt my chest tighten, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Do you know who he is?" He shook his head. "Not exactly. Laura didn't go into details, just said Rachel had been distracted lately, and that she's been spending more time away from home." I took a long breath, the confirmation hitting me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a fling, or a mistake. It was something she'd been hiding, something she'd been lying about from the start. As I drove home that night, my mind raced with 1,000 plans, each one darker than the last. This wasn't going to end here. Rachel thought she could betray me and walk away like nothing happened, but she was wrong. She had no idea what was coming. And when it did, she'd be left with nothing but regret. After my talk with Tom, I felt a new kind of clarity settle over me. I knew what I had to do next. Rachel thought she could keep everything hidden, slip away to her fantasy life, and then come back to me like nothing had happened. But I was done playing the fool. The following week, I acted like everything was normal. I went through the motions at work, kept up casual conversation with Rachel, even cooked dinner a few nights like old times. She seemed to relax, maybe assuming that her confession was enough to make things right or that I'd accepted her flimsy apologies. Little did she know, I was far from letting this go. On Wednesday, she told me she'd be going out again. "To Jessica's," she said. This time, I didn't follow her. Instead, I stayed home and waited. I had my own plan to put in motion, and it started with gathering proof. I knew I'd need every bit of evidence if I was going to end this the way I wanted. I'd already saved copies of the photos and the messages from her phone, which I'd found one night after she'd fallen asleep. Now I needed more, something undeniable. So I made a call. One of my friends, Andrew, worked in tech and owed me a favor. I told him I needed access to some deleted messages and call records on Rachel's phone. It wasn't entirely above board, but Andrew understood the situation, and he agreed to help. "Send me whatever you have," he said, and I emailed him the backups I'd taken. The next day, he called me back with a simple message. "You were right, man. There's more." He forwarded a list of texts, phone calls, and locations Rachel had tried to hide. There were dozens of messages with her mystery man, ranging from innocent check-ins to flirtatious exchanges, and they stretched back months. She'd gone to great lengths to cover her tracks, but the proof was there, laid out in cold, black and white text. That evening, I didn't mention a thing to Rachel. I let her come home, slipping quietly through the door and smiling at me, her expression carefully neutral. We ate dinner, barely talking, the silence a thick barrier between us. But I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. It was all leading to a single moment, and I wanted to make sure it hit her like a freight train. The next day, I reached out to a lawyer. I told him everything, showed him the evidence I'd collected. He was a straightforward man, no nonsense, and his advice was clear. If I wanted to get the upper hand in any divorce proceedings, I had to move quickly and make sure I had everything documented. "She's in the wrong here," he said. "And if you have proof, the courts will see it." That Friday, Rachel told me she'd be out again. To Jessica's. Of course. But this time, I knew better. As soon as she left, I packed a bag and went to stay with my brother, someone I knew I could trust. I didn't want to face her when the fallout hit. I wanted her to come home to an empty house, to a quiet message waiting for her on the table, telling her where to find me and that we needed to talk. When I returned the next morning, the house was silent. The note I'd left on the kitchen table was crumpled, her keys tossed beside it. She was nowhere to be found. I waited, letting her process everything, knowing that soon enough she'd have no choice but to face what she'd done. She returned late that evening, her face pale, eyes red from what looked like hours of crying. She looked at me, guilt and fear shadowing her expression. For a moment she seemed like a stranger, someone I couldn't recognize. "What now?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I felt a strange satisfaction watching her realize that she couldn't hide anymore. "Now," I said, my voice calm. "Now we move forward. But not together." The truth was out, and there was no going back. Rachel stood there in silence, her face crumbling as the weight of it all hit her. I could see the panic in her eyes, the realization that this was real, that she couldn't talk her way out of it. She took a shaky breath, looking down at the floor. "Please, let's talk about this," she whispered, barely able to meet my gaze. "I know I messed up, but we can work through it. We can fix this." I scoffed, feeling a surge of anger I'd barely managed to hold back. "Fix this? How, Rachel? How are you going to fix the months of lying, of sneaking around? This wasn't just one night. This was a choice you made over and over again." Tears started to roll down her cheeks, but I didn't feel a shred of sympathy. She'd made this bed, and now she'd have to lie in it. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't realize what I was doing," she stammered. "You didn't realize?" I laughed bitterly. "You went behind my back, lied to my face, and pretended everything was fine. And you expect me to believe you didn't realize?" She was quiet, and I could see her struggling for words, her mind racing for something to say that would make this right. But there was nothing. She knew it, and so did I. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I already spoke to a lawyer," I said, watching her face as the words sank in. "I've got the paperwork ready. You'll get served in a few days." Rachel's face went pale, her hand flying to her mouth. You're divorcing me?" she choked out. "What did you expect?" I asked, my tone cold. "That I'd just forgive and forget? That we'd pretend this never happened?" She shook her head, her voice breaking. "Please don't do this. I know I messed up, but I love you. I can't lose you." "You already lost me," I replied, turning away. "The moment you chose him over me, you lost me." She tried to reach for me, her hand shaking, but I stepped back. I couldn't stand the sight of her anymore. Every part of me wanted to yell, to make her feel the same pain I'd been carrying. But I forced myself to stay calm, to keep my voice steady. "Pack your things," I said finally, my tone flat. "I want you out by tomorrow." She nodded slowly, realizing that this was the end. Her shoulders slumped, and she turned away, disappearing into the bedroom to gather her things. I stood there for a long time, listening to the sound of her packing, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. This wasn't how I'd pictured our life together ending, but maybe it was for the best. The next day, she was gone. She left a final note on the kitchen table, a weak apology scribbled hastily in her handwriting. I read it once, then tossed it in the trash, feeling a strange sense of closure as the last reminder of her disappeared. For the first time in months, the house was quiet. I stood there, alone in the silence, realizing that this was a new beginning. It wasn't the one I'd wanted, but it was mine. The silence of the house was overwhelming at first. Each empty room felt like it was echoing back memories I didn't want to face. Lazy Sundays with Rachel on the couch, dinners in the kitchen, laughter filling the spaces that now felt hauntingly quiet. I kept myself busy, clearing out anything that reminded me of her. Old photos, clothes she'd left behind, even little trinkets and notes. Each item was a painful reminder, but with each one gone, I felt lighter. I wasn't in a hurry to move on, but I wasn't about to let myself wallow either. The weekend passed quietly, and by Monday, I was back at work, determined to keep going. Colleagues noticed I was more withdrawn than usual, but I brushed off their questions, pretending everything was fine. I'd started to get used to the idea that this was my life now, my own, no strings, no shadows of betrayal lurking around every corner. Then, just when I thought I'd settled into a new normal, I ran into Tom again, Rachel's friend Jessica's husband. He looked at me with a mix of pity and discomfort that I was beginning to recognize. Everyone seemed to know what had happened by now. Gossip travels fast. "Hey man," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Just wanted to check in. I heard about everything. Rough stuff. How are you holding up?" I shrugged, trying to seem unfazed. "I'm doing all right. Moving forward, you know?" He nodded, looking thoughtful. "I know this might be hard to hear, but you're probably better off. Laura told me some things after you left that night." The mention of his wife's name made me pause. "What do you mean?" Tom shifted, glancing around before lowering his voice. "Apparently this guy, the one Rachel was with, they go way back from college. Laura thinks this wasn't the first time they'd been in touch. She even mentioned they might have seen each other on and off for years." The floor felt like it was slipping out from under me. "Years?" I whispered, barely able to process the word. "Yeah," he nodded solemnly. "I thought it was just a fling too. But Laura said Rachel had talked about him even before the reunion. Said he was the one that got away or something." Tom's face was sympathetic but firm. "I thought you should know." I felt numb. All this time, I'd been focusing on Rachel's recent betrayal, trying to understand how she could hurt me so deeply. But this? The idea that she'd been pining for someone else, holding on to an old flame, it was a fresh, sickening blow. The conversation with Tom stuck with me for days. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe Rachel had never really been mine, that our whole marriage had been a cover for feelings she couldn't let go of. I had believed in our life together, given her everything, while she kept this secret, this fantasy, tucked away like a precious treasure. The anger that had been smoldering inside me turned into something darker, something more final. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I thought about every moment we'd shared, every promise she'd broken. I couldn't undo what had happened, but I could at least make sure she'd feel the weight of her choices. I knew exactly what I needed to do next. The anger gnawed at me, relentless, like an itch I couldn't scratch. Every day, I felt myself slipping deeper into thoughts I could barely recognize. Since she'd moved in with Jessica, Rachel seemed to be getting on with life just fine, even managing to cast herself as the victim. I could almost hear the story she was likely spinning, probably explaining to anyone who would listen how complicated things were and how confused she'd been. That thought alone made my blood boil. That Saturday, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to drive by Jessica's place, unsure of what I was looking for, but too restless to stay at home. When I got close, I parked a block away, far enough to stay out of sight but close enough to see if anything happened. I half hoped it would be a waste of time, that she wouldn't actually be there, that maybe she'd even try to talk to me. But just a few minutes later, a car pulled up, a familiar one. It was him, the guy from the reunion. I watched as he stepped out of his car, looking perfectly at ease. He walked up to Jessica's door with an easy swagger, like he'd been here before, like he knew his way around. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I watched him knock. A moment later, Rachel opened the door, and her face lit up. It was a smile I hadn't seen in years, a kind of smile she hadn't shared with me in God knows how long. She leaned in and hugged him, fingers brushing the back of his neck, lingering as they whispered to each other. They looked like they were sharing some private joke, like they'd known each other forever. I could only imagine what they were saying, probably laughing about me, about how foolish I'd been. The realization hit me that, to her, I was just a memory now. She'd already replaced me, and the life we'd built together was nothing but a shadow to her. After a few minutes, they went inside, the door closing behind them. I sat there, feeling a mixture of rage and disbelief. I wanted to go up there, to pound on the door, to confront them both. But something held me back. There was no point in causing a scene. That wouldn't change a thing. I'd spent months being hurt and blindsided, but I'd be damned if I'd let her see that. If anything, this was just the final nail in the coffin, proof of who she'd really been all along. I finally started the car and drove home, each mile pushing me further from the life I'd once known. My thoughts darkened, growing colder and more calculated. Rachel had spent months, maybe even years, lying to my face, playing this twisted game while making me believe we were building a life together. She'd managed to keep me in the dark for so long, making me look like a fool, but I was done playing that part. When I got home, I picked up my phone and dialed Tom's number. He answered almost immediately, his voice warm. "Hey, man. Everything all right?" I paused for a second, letting my voice settle. "Tom, I need a favor. Just a small one. Think you could help me out?" There was a moment's hesitation on his end, but then he spoke, his voice firm. "Of course. What do you need?" We met up that evening to talk over a plan. Tom had been as angry about the whole thing as I was, feeling betrayed not just by Rachel but by Jessica, who had clearly known about the affair and had even helped cover for it. It turned out that the night Rachel had stayed at Jessica's, Jessica had been out, leaving Rachel and her guy alone to enjoy their night together. Knowing he'd been lied to as well, Tom didn't hesitate when I told him what I wanted. The plan was simple. Tom would invite Rachel and James, yes, I'd finally learned his name, over for a casual get-together. With Jessica gone for the night, it would just be the three of them, and I'd set up a small camera in Tom's den, a room off to the side where they'd be less likely to notice anything. The night of the get-together, I parked near Tom's place, far enough to stay out of sight but close enough to watch. A little while later, I saw James's car pull up, Rachel beside him in the passenger seat. They walked up to the house together, laughing, arms touching, as if they didn't have a care in the world. Once they were inside, I slipped into Tom's den to make sure the setup was perfect. Tom had texted me earlier, letting me know they'd be hanging out in there, playing some music, and chatting. I checked the camera, adjusted it slightly, and left, positioning myself in a nearby cafe with my phone set up to watch the live feed. What I saw made my stomach turn. They were so comfortable with each other, talking with the ease of two people who'd been doing this for months, if not years. James was telling her a story, and she laughed, leaning in closer, resting her hand on his arm. I'd never seen her look so at ease. It was like she was a completely different person with him, a person I'd never known, never been allowed to know. They were talking about me too. Tom had managed to steer the conversation that way. At first, Rachel seemed hesitant, but as she spoke, I could see her relax, getting more comfortable in trashing the life we'd built. She spoke about our marriage like it was nothing, like it had been an inconvenience she'd tolerated for years. She even laughed about the day she'd moved her things out, saying she hadn't felt a single ounce of regret. And there, as she spoke, it hit me. She didn't just feel free now. She'd been feeling free from me long before I'd ever known. This life with James wasn't something she'd stumbled into. She'd probably been planning her escape all along. I closed the feed, my hands shaking. I had everything I needed, more proof than I'd ever wanted. And as I sat there in that small cafe, I felt something inside me settle. I wasn't going to be the fool she left in the dust, the man she walked away from without a second thought. I was going to make sure that when she remembered me, it was with regret. The next morning, I reviewed the recordings with my lawyer. He listened silently, watching the footage with a look of grim satisfaction. When it was over, he turned to me, his voice steady. "This is more than enough. You'll get what you deserve. Trust me." And that was all I needed to hear. For the next few days, I prepared in silence. Rachel continued to stay with Jessica, but I knew that soon she'd have no choice but to face the reality she'd created. I had all the evidence, all the proof, everything I needed to take control of the situation. And when the time came, I'd be ready. Because this wasn't just about winning. It was about making sure she felt the weight of every lie, every choice, every betrayal. The next morning, I filed everything with my lawyer. The recordings, the receipts, the copies of her messages, all of it. My lawyer assured me that Rachel didn't have a leg to stand on. "With this much proof, you'll get the house, and you could probably get away without paying a cent of alimony," he said, barely containing a smirk. "Courts don't take kindly to affairs." I nodded, the satisfaction growing as I imagined her reaction when she realized just how much she was about to lose. I'd dedicated years of my life to Rachel, trusting her completely, but she'd thrown it all away like it was nothing. Now, she was going to feel the full weight of that choice. 2 days later, Rachel was served. I made sure the process server delivered the papers to Jessica's house, where she'd been staying. She called me immediately, her voice panicked, shaky, begging me to let her come over and talk. I let her plead, staying silent as she tried to explain herself over the phone. When her voice finally broke into a sob, I answered with a cold, "There's nothing to talk about, Rachel. You made your choice." I hung up, feeling strangely calm. There was no more room for her lies or half-hearted apologies. The following day, she showed up at my door, looking disheveled and lost. She knocked softly, calling my name in a voice that was barely a whisper. I waited a minute, wondering if she'd just leave. But she didn't. She kept knocking, almost frantically, and finally, I opened the door. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed red. "Please, let's just talk for a minute," she stammered. "I know I hurt you, but we don't have to end it like this." I leaned against the doorframe, studying her, feeling nothing but a cold, hard emptiness. "This is exactly how it should end, Rachel. You made that decision for us both the moment you chose him over me." She winced, biting her lip as she struggled for words. "I know it was a mistake. I lost sight of everything. But we can work through this, can't we? I'm willing to do anything to make it up to you." "Anything?" I said, raising an eyebrow. "So where was that willingness when you decided to lie to me? When you walked out to be with him over and over again?" She looked away, her shoulders slumping as if she couldn't bear the weight of her own choices. "It just happened," she whispered, as if that made it better. "I got caught up, I lost myself." I took a step closer, lowering my voice. "You didn't lose yourself, Rachel. You knew exactly what you were doing. You planned it, lied to my face, and then laughed about it with him. And you expect me to take you back?" Her eyes widened, a flicker of fear replacing the guilt. "What do you mean, laughed about it?" she asked, her voice wavering. I held her gaze, letting the silence stretch out just long enough for her to realize that I knew everything. "Oh, I heard it all," I said. "Every word. How you talked about our marriage like it was some trivial thing, how you said you felt nothing for me. Do you know what that's like, Rachel? Hearing the woman you loved speak about you like a stranger?" She took a shaky breath, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I didn't mean it. I was confused, lost. Please, just give me a chance to make this right." I let out a bitter laugh. "There's nothing left for you to make right. You burned it all down yourself." Rachel took a step back, her face crumpling as she realized the finality of it. For the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. She looked around, as if expecting someone else to show up, to offer her a way out, but no one did. "Fine," she whispered, barely able to look at me. "I'll go. But I want you to know that I loved you. I still do." "You loved me?" I said, my voice a low, dangerous whisper. Don't insult me. Love isn't what you did. Love doesn't look for an escape plan. She looked at me one last time, her face full of regret and desperation. But I felt nothing for her anymore. The woman I had loved was gone, replaced by this stranger who couldn't even look at me without flinching. Without another word, she turned and walked down the steps, each footfall fading into the distance as she left. That night, I sat alone in the quiet house, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief. There was no guilt, no remorse, just a calm, final silence. I knew she'd never come back. And even if she tried, I'd never let her in again. She was gone, for good, and I was finally free. The days after Rachel left were oddly calm, almost peaceful. It was strange, how quickly life resumed without her presence. The silence that once felt suffocating now seemed like a clean slate. I went back to work, found a rhythm, and began rediscovering things I had put on hold for years. Then, a week later, I got a call from Jessica. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Her voice was strained, hesitant. I thought you should know, she started. Rachel isn't doing well. She's struggling, and she keeps talking about you. She's a mess, really. There was a part of me that wanted to feel satisfied, to think that Rachel was finally facing the consequences of her choices. But as much as I wanted to move on, I felt something tugging at me. Maybe it was old habits, or the remnants of love I'd once felt. But I pushed the thought aside, thanked Jessica for letting me know, and hung up. The next day, Rachel called me. I let it go to voicemail, thinking she'd leave a quick message and that would be it. But her voice was shaky, desperate, like she was holding on to some threadbare hope. Please, can we just talk? She said. I know you don't owe me anything, but I need to see you. Just one last time. I wasn't planning to respond, but that night, as I lay awake, something kept gnawing at me. Maybe it was the years we'd spent together, or the sense of unfinished business. I didn't know. But against my better judgment, I texted her back, agreeing to meet at a small cafe we'd often gone to when we first started dating. The place held memories, ones I wanted to reclaim in my own way. When I arrived, Rachel was already sitting at a corner table, looking exhausted. Her face was pale, and her eyes were shadowed from lack of sleep. She looked up when I walked in, her expression a mixture of relief and something I couldn't quite place. Thank you for coming, she said softly as I sat down. I nodded, keeping my expression blank. What did you want to talk about? She stared at her hands, twisting them nervously. I just wanted to apologize, she whispered. I know I can't undo anything. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I needed to say it to your face. I made a mistake. No, I made 1,000 mistakes. And I hurt the one person I thought would never leave. I listened unmoved. I'd heard these words before, and I wasn't interested in empty apologies. Why? I asked simply. Why did you do it, Rachel? Why him? She took a shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. Maybe it was boredom, maybe it was. I don't even know, honestly. But I lost sight of everything that mattered. And now I'm paying the price. She looked up, meeting my eyes with a flicker of hope. Is there any chance for us? Any chance to rebuild, even if it's just as friends? Her question hung in the air, but I felt nothing but a cold resolve. Friends? After everything? The thought alone was insulting. I'd built my life around her, and she'd torn it down without a second thought. There was no version of the future where she could be a part of my life again. No, Rachel, I said firmly. There's no going back. There's no friendship to salvage here. You made your choice. Her face crumpled, and she nodded, accepting the truth. I understand, she murmured. I don't expect anything from you. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I watched her, the woman I had once loved, and felt only a hollow emptiness where that love had been. There was nothing more to say. After a few minutes, she gathered her things and left. I watched her go, feeling a strange sense of finality. I knew this was truly the end. When I returned home that night, the house felt different, lighter. There were no more shadows, no lingering regrets. I'd confronted my past, faced it head on, and walked away unscathed. Rachel was gone, a part of my life that had faded into memory, and I was finally ready to move forward. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a rhythm that was both unfamiliar and refreshing. I'd spent so long adjusting myself around Rachel's wants, needs, and moods that I'd forgotten what it felt like to make choices purely for myself. The house felt different, too, cleaner, more organized, as though even the walls had shed memories that had once held me down. One evening, I went out with some old friends who had known about the breakup but hadn't pried too deeply. We ended up at a small bar, laughing over drinks, telling stories that had nothing to do with Rachel or the mess she'd left behind. For the first time in a long while, I felt genuinely happy, like I was reconnecting with a version of myself I'd buried under years of compromise. Then, just when I thought the past was truly behind me, an unexpected text arrived. It was from Laura, Tom's wife, who had been friends with Rachel. "Hey, can we talk?" she wrote. "I think you should know something." Curious, I called her, half expecting it to be about Rachel trying to stir something up again. But what she told me took me completely by surprise. "Listen," Laura began, her tone apologetic. "I feel terrible for not telling you sooner, but I only just found out. Rachel was seeing James long before the reunion. I think she might have even stayed with him when she told you she was going to Jessica's over the years. It wasn't a recent thing at all." The floor seemed to shift beneath me. So Rachel's betrayal wasn't just a recent slip, it was a years-long deception, woven into the fabric of our lives. All those times she claimed she was with Jessica or working late, they hadn't been innocent missteps or temptations she'd just given into once. This had been planned, calculated, a second life hidden right under my nose. "I'm sorry," Laura said, her voice thick with guilt. "Tom and we didn't know. If we'd known, we would have told you." "It's not your fault, Laura," I replied, my voice calm, even though my mind was reeling. "Thank you for telling me. It actually makes things clearer." When I hung up, a strange sense of relief settled over me. As twisted as it was, I finally understood that Rachel's betrayal hadn't been about some failing on my part, something I could have prevented or fixed. This was who she was, who she'd always been. She'd been living a lie long before I ever suspected. That night, I sat in my quiet house, absorbing everything. Oddly, I didn't feel the anger or bitterness I might have expected. Instead, I felt free, like the final piece of a weight had been lifted. I no longer had to question myself, or the choices I'd made, or wonder where I'd gone wrong. I realized now that I'd done everything I could, given her everything I had. She'd been the one to betray it all, and it had nothing to do with me. Months passed, and the memories of Rachel and our life together faded into something distant, like an old book tucked away on a shelf, gathering dust. I'd begun to focus on new goals, hobbies I'd ignored, people I'd lost touch with. My world felt expansive again, full of potential. One evening, as I was cleaning out a drawer, I found a small photo of Rachel and me from our early days, back when I thought she was the love of my life. I looked at it for a long time, remembering the innocence, the hope, the dreams we'd once shared. But that person in the picture, that man who'd believed in her so deeply, was gone. He'd grown, transformed, no longer tied to the fantasy he'd once cherished. I tossed the photo into the trash, a small smile on my face. Rachel was gone, and I was more than ready to leave her there, in the past where she belonged. My life, my real life, was finally beginning. And for the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, hit like and leave a comment with your favorite part. We'd love to hear your perspective.